Welcome to the Forge, my wanton wildlings. I'm your creepsmith, and I hope you like my work. One of the most influential names in modern popular horror fiction is that of Howard Phillips Lovecraft. A giant of weird fiction and arguably the biggest name in cosmic horror, at least in the English-speaking world. If you're any sort of Lovecraft fan, or even a fan of horror in general, you'll have already heard of the Necronomicon. By far the most famous fictional book of the genre, it's found its way into movies, comics, games, and all sorts of stories worldwide. One of the reasons that this imaginary connection of lore is so central to the scariness of Lovecraft's tales is said to be that it plays into the author's self-image. You see, he saw himself as an intellectual, and more in tune with the nature of reality than the average person, and curious about all those things that give shape to our world. This, combined with his fear of everything outside his personal sphere of experience, and his view that the universe gives not one iota of care for humanity, translates to a victim-eye view that readers can readily empathize with. The scholar seeking knowledge beyond mortal ken and being driven into madness because he finds it is one of the great warning tropes of the horror genre, popularized in this day and age largely in the form of this book. Originally titled Kitab al-Azif, or simply al-Azif, in the early 8th century, supposedly around 730 AD, by Abdul al-Hazred. No, that's not a correct Arabic name, or at least it doesn't follow the cultural naming conventions of the time. Known as Half-Mad, al-Hazred was a Yemeni scholar and heretic known to worship outer gods Yog-Sothoth and Cthulhu. He supposedly wrote his most famous work while living in Damascus, shortly before dying by being publicly torn to pieces in broad daylight by an invisible assailant. The book itself became surprisingly popular for an esoteric collection of insane ramblings by a little-known madman-turned-hamburger, containing mentions of various monstrous deities, horrible minions, as well as the supposed origins for these beings, summoning incantations for some of them, and various spells of other kinds for the edification and occasional consumption of the reader. It was translated into Greek in the year 950 by the Constantinopolitan Theodorus Philetus, and after a century of impelling certain experimenters to terrible attempts, it was suppressed by Patriarch Michael in 1050. Nonetheless, it was translated again from Greek to Latin by Olaus Wormius, not to be confused with his non-fictional counterpart who lived 3 centuries later, in 1228. Despite almost immediately receiving a papal ban, the Latin version was still being printed as late as the 17th century. The book appears or is mentioned in various Lovecraft stories such as The Nameless City, The Mountains of Madness, The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, as well as having pages of the Miskatonic library copy be stolen in the Dunwich Horror. The Necronomicon, however, is far from the only work of such otherworldly knowledge in Yog-Sotherian mythology. If you take into account the whole cycle of not only the original author's work, but also the works of his contemporaries, co-authors, and literary followers, there are quite a few other tomes to be considered. They run the gamut from collections of tales to grimoires to fragments of broken tablets millennia old. What they share is the effect that they have on those who seek their forbidden knowledge, that being madness and death such seekers almost inevitably find. While these works may not have garnered all of the attention of the famous Dread book, each has its own history and horrors to tease one's dreams with. De Vermis Mysteris. This terrible treatise was thought up by Robert Bloch for the 1935 tale The Shambala from the Stars. The work is described as a grimoire of spells and enchantments apparently meant to contact outer gods, even being able to summon some entities physically. It was written by mage and necromancer Ludwig Prynne, who reached an unbelievable age before being put to death in flames. Apparently he was born in 1271, executed in the early 16th century. Even though it wasn't one of his, Lovecraft does mention this book in The Haunter of the Dark and The Shadow Out of Time, as well as describing it in a letter as repeating the most hellish secrets learned by early man. Cult des Ghouls. Interestingly, this publication has been claimed as the creation of both Robert Bloch and H.P. Lovecraft, as well as August Derleth. It is a collection of tales regarding a secret cult among the aristocratic libertines of France that practiced necrophagy, necromancy, and necrophilia. It was written in 1702 by Comte François-Honoré Balfour. Separated into two sections with others that may not exist in some versions, it basically describes the language called Nathic of the cults, as well as their mythology, and the second section contains semi-autobiographical tales of the author converting to and participating in cult belief and practice. It is strongly implied that the author wrote this latter section centuries later than the first, implying a greatly extended lifetime. Oh, I hope I can pronounce this one. The unspeakable Kulten. Also known as the Nameless Cults or the Black Book, this work was invented by Robert Howard in 1931. Because these were English-speaking authors who only loosely stuck to the language conventions they delved into, translations of this title were somewhat interesting. So the title possibly translates as Unspeakable Cults, of Unspeakable Cults, or Unpronounceable Cults. In any case, the book reportedly contains knowledge about various truly ancient religious proto-cults worshipping certain pre-human deities, some specifically making mention of Gatanatoa or Bran Mak Morn. The author of the work is a rather tough-to-research fellow named Friedrich Wilhelm von Junst. The Necrotic Manuscripts. Finally, one made up by the man himself. Also called the Necrotic Fragments, this was invented in 1918 for the story Polaris. One of the few works in this list without a specific author, it is supposedly, at least in part, a product of the great race of Yith, perhaps brought to Earth by one of their transfer subjects. Published in the land of Lomar, spread to Hyperborea, where the references of the book were expanded by a tribe called the Vormi, there are few descriptions of the book's contents other than as a source of forbidden arcana. But given the Yithian propensity toward recording historical, cultural, and scientific information, one can make some guesses. There are occasional references to certain stories and myths recorded therein, but specifics are few. The Book of Ibon. A product of the fancy of one Clark Ashton Smith, this volume appears in several of Lovecraft's work from The Haunter of the Dark to Dreams in the Witch House, among others. Its eponymous author was reportedly a wizard of ancient Hyperborea in the land of Muthalan. It was handed down and translated into Egyptian, Greek, Latin, and French editions. Another of the grimoires, this one contains various spellcraft, including at least one purely offensive technique that infects a target with something called the Green Decay. Yuck. The Eltdown Shards. Included in a 1935 story, The Sealed Casket, these prehistoric scrawlings owe their mentions to Richard Seawright. Written on pottery fragments found in early Triassic shale just outside an American town called Eltdown in 1891, a similarly etched set of tablets was found across the pond in Sussex, again in a similar stratum of prehistoric stone. There's even a supposed third set handed down since time immemorial by a truly ancient cult with a penchant for holding on to knowledge they're better off forgetting. It's said the fragments contain more knowledge of the Yithians, describing their homeworld, a record of their fateful dealings with a race called the Yacubians, and in one fragment there's a summoning ritual for something that it calls the Warder of Knowledge. Don't ever use it, though, because the part of the ritual used to dismiss or rebuke the entity is mangled or garbled in some way, leaving any potential summoner unable to rid themselves of an eldritch presence that may not like them very much. Supposedly, despite being about the Yithians, the fragments were written by the Elder Ones during their rule of Earth. The 7 Cryptical Books of San. Another of the originals from Lovecraft, this series of scrolls used in 1921's The Other Gods, as well as The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath. Written in the 2nd century AD by a philosopher known only as San, they were originally titled the 7 Cryptical Books of Earth. Each scroll concentrates on one entity or culture and the unique knowledge that may be gleaned from each. For instance, the first scroll describes the miracles invented by Huang Ti, the Yellow Emperor, perhaps a form of Hastur, and some readers have been able to glean from these hints a way to return the dead to life, among other things. The 5th scroll describes various methods of communication with several different kinds of entities, such as the deep ones of the South China Sea, the Hounds of Tindalos, ways to search through space and time, and a drug called Liao. The scroll, if studied properly, will actually yield ways to summon a Tindalos hound, though attempting to control such entities is foolish at best. The books were translated into English and smuggled out of China in the 19th century, but as always, something is lost in the translation. The People of the Monolith. Supposedly another way for H.P. to indulge his love of poetry, the book is credited to Robert Howard. Written by a Yankee mad poet, one Justin Joffrey, this book is described as a thin volume containing a single poem by that same title. The Book of Azathoth. Lovecraft's answer to the trope of the satanic witch pledging themselves to the devil, this volume is most prominently used in The Dreams of the Witch House. It is described as of prodigious size, and the most well-known portion of its contents are the signatures, in blood of course, of those that Nyarlathotep's Black Man has persuaded to pledge themselves to the blind idiot god Azathoth. The Xantho Tablets. A much later entry, this collection was invented by Lynn Carter for his 1971 tale The Dweller in the Tomb. These black jade tablets were allegedly inscribed by a Ythoghan wizard priest named Xantho. For literary creatives, these folks sure don't put much effort into naming their fictional literature. Found in 1913 by the Copeland expedition to Sang to find Xantho's tomb, the slabs contained a partial history of the sunken continent of Mu, and a cosmic proxy war against a spreading influence of the followers of Gitana Thoa, including a botched attempt to release the god Ythogha from its prison. Originally written in a language called Nakal, Copeland translated them roughly to English and heavily edited the translation for public sanity. Where the originals are now is unknown. There are, of course, others. The Book of Iod, Chat Aquadigan, the Dole Chants, the Garn Fragments, the Parsons of Nam, Las Relas de Ruina, and on and on. There's even a play, The King in Yellow. For keepers of forbidden and secret lore, this world's rogue scholars and cultists sure love to spread their arcane knowledge around. These fictional works are liberally reinforced, of course, by mentions of actual esoteric and mystical works, most of which can be traced to such subjects as Egyptian magic, witch hunting, cults or other polytheistic religions, and old and lost civilizations. And while these may not be as famous as the Necronomicon, There's madness aplenty to go around in their pages, I assure you. So happy reading, stay scary, and make the most of your nights. Hey guys, if you're still listening, I just wanted to say thank you for sticking it out, and also I'm sorry about any mispronunciations, but it is Lovecraft, so you know how hard it is to get that stuff right. Anyway, thank you, and I will see you in the next video.